Okay, you are listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 16.5 in Philadelphia, on Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHM WPPM. Tonight on the program, we'll be joined by Vanessa Maria Graper of Free Press and Vincent Thompson of Thompson Mediaman Communications. With us, as always, is Denise Clay Murray. Denise, how are you tonight?
I'm good. How are you?
Fine, thank you. And Lance Haver. Lance, how are you doing?
I'm all right.
Great. Now, before we bring our panel on, we have a lot to talk about tonight. It was a very interesting election night. Some things still unresolved. We don't know who has control of the House at the federal level. There are some Senate races that are still in play. So a lot to talk about. But before we get into that content, Lance, I wanted to talk a little bit about Philadelphia and what happened in Philadelphia as it relates to the more underprivileged zip codes in the city and what that voter turnout looked like.
Well, thank you. If we could pull up the map of the wards. So this is following on Denise's work. Denise has talked over the last 6 months about how low-income neighborhoods aren't really asked to participate in the elections. And it's a very difficult thing to show because there's the ward map, which is what we're looking at now. So the city is broken up into 66 wards. And then there's the census tract data, which is broken up by zip codes. So it's not a perfect overlay. A ward isn't a zip code. Sometimes there's more than one zip code in a ward. Sometimes there's more than one ward is in more than one zip code, but it's a close approximation. And then all the voter turnout is done ward by ward and not by census tract. So I know that Senate-elect Fetterman talked about how he went all over the state and was trying to get counties that historically voted red to vote for him. And he was saying that that's what he did. Now, I think that's putting a best frame on a situation. Most of the counties that traditionally voted Republican still voted Republican, and the Republicans still carried those counties. The senator-elect did better than other Democrats had done, but he didn't carry them. And that's a nice way of talking about it. But every vote matters. Every person matters. But when we look at what happened in the city of Philadelphia, again, working on Denise's background information, I'm going to ask you to go to the next slide. So we can see from this map, the darker the area, the poorer the area. And again, it doesn't correlate perfectly to the ward map, but you can see in north central Philadelphia and all the way up on the river is where in West Philadelphia are the densest population of low-income families, people who are really struggling economically, people who have fallen down and really need to help to get back up. And when we start looking at the voter turnout, it's somewhat counterintuitive. The better off people are, the less they need the help of government, the higher the turnout. And the more people who need help from government, the lower the turnout. So I'm going to now go back to the ward map for a second, and we're going to flip back and forth. It'll be a little confusing. What we're going to look at now is some of the higher voter turnout, which comes out of this area, which is the wealthier Northeast. And so you can see that these wards, the 66th ward, the 65th ward, they're around 50%. Half of the people who are registered to vote are voting. And these, again, are areas where we're going to look at the poverty map. So these are these areas up here. Can people see my pointer? Okay. So they're in the top right part of the map. When you go to the census data, you see that those are areas are not low income. And you see that those voters have turned out at large numbers. But if we go to the next, the lowest turnouts. So this is the 23rd ward, 27% of the people voted. 33rd ward, 25%. 43rd ward, 23%. And the 47th ward, 25%. So 1 out of 4 voters who are registered are voting. An incredibly low turnout. Now, senator-elect didn't come into those neighborhoods and didn't campaign in those neighborhoods, despite the fact that these are neighborhoods where people need to get back up. They need some help getting back up. And they are certainly have been forgotten. But part of the strategy was not to talk to them and not to look at what their situation is. Now, again, I'm going to go back to the ward map so people can see it's in the central part of North Philadelphia. That's where these wards are. And when we go to the census tract data, we see that the darker color is the poverty areas. And those are the darker areas are the areas which have the lowest voter turnout. And as we talk about the election returns and we talk about what's happened, one of the questions I would like to raise, and hopefully we'll talk about as we go forward, is if we don't engage people in these wards, these people who are struggling economically, these people who need some help getting back on their feet, we're never going to develop the type of programs that are necessary to have some economic justice. And that's one of the things I hope as we talk about the election, we talk about what Lieutenant Governor Fetterman, now Senator-elect Fetterman, did, when we talk about what Attorney General, now Governor-elect Shapiro, did, we can ask, why didn't they find a message that would get people who are really struggling to come out and vote? And I think, well, if you can just go back to I'll go back to the ward map. We'll leave that up for a little bit. And that's really the question. We know where the voter turnout is. We know, for example, in the 9th ward, which is Chestnut Hill, if we go back to the turnout there for the 9th ward, we can see that the 9th ward has a 65% turnout. Center City, the 1st ward, 2nd ward, which is Queen Village, Bella Vista, 55%. In Mount Airy, 57%. And in Roxborough, Mattiunk, 54%. So we see that in all these places, there is wealth and there is voter turnout. In all the places where there is no wealth, we see that there is very little in the way of voter turnout. Twice as many people are showing up to vote in Chestnut Hill, where economically people are much better off than in North Central Philadelphia, where people really need the help of government programs for jobs, for education, for employment.
So, Denise, you've been doing a lot of work on this. What are some of the reasons why we haven't seen that concerted message to these neighborhoods?
That is the $64,000 question. And it's one that people have been asking for a long time. You don't have to really inspire, quote unquote, the wealthy to come out and vote, because they understand that if you're wealthy and you want to remain wealthy, that's the way. I mean, controlling your government controls your world. And I think that no one has really taken the time to go to people in the city's more poverty-stricken areas and explain, without being condescending, why it's important to go to the polls. And the fact that one of the problems that I had when I was, dealing with the Fetterman campaign and trying to do stories on the campaign, was he kept talking about working class. He kept talking about working class and people that our government had forgotten and all of that. And I kept asking, what is your definition of working class? Because does that definition include these areas that Lance just pointed out? And it's going to be interesting to see if in Congress he answers that question, because Pat Toomey, the senator that's outgoing, he not only didn't go to those areas, he ignored them, and by extension, the city of Philadelphia, almost completely. So it's going to be really, really interesting to see how those questions get answered now that the election is over.
Okay, I'd like to bring in Vanessa Maria Graber of Free Press, and Vincent Thompson of Thompson Mediaman Communications. I'd like to thank both of you for being with us, as always, and we greatly appreciate it. Vanessa, let me come to you first. We spoke a little bit about this last week. What is your take on why these neighborhoods have been ignored?
Yeah, hello. Thanks for having me. For folks that missed last week's show, I actually answered this question in depth, but I'll repeat what I said, which is there's several factors here. One is that, as Denise mentioned, they don't come to these neighborhoods at all to give campaign information, to canvass, but more importantly, just to educate people on basic voting rights and accessibility, right? So folks are not really sure where their polling locations are, how to get mail-in ballots, what the ballot initiative questions are, when the last day to register to vote. There's a lot of young people, voting for the first time or eligible to vote for the first time. There's a whole wave of Puerto Rican people, for example, coming to North Philadelphia that are U.S. citizens that are able to vote, but that are not familiar with the system. So there's some very basic civic voter education that's lacking, right? And not a lot of people to support folks, in general. Secondly, we see that, the Democratic campaigns, they just don't spend the resources trying to contact folks. A lot of people don't receive any information at all. I was looking at a Unidos US poll in Pennsylvania, and it said, only 35% of Latinos received any voter information at all in the mail. That means most people aren't getting anything. They're not receiving the text messages and emails that a lot of us are getting because they're not on those lists. They don't provide information in Spanish. There is a large Spanish-speaking community in North Philadelphia, and, those people want to vote too. There's no information for them either. But, as I said last week, there's a really big disconnect between party politics and what people are living in their day-to-day lives. So when they talk in generalities, about the big issues like inflation and abortion, immigration, jobs, that doesn't actually translate to most people who are experiencing poverty and living paycheck to paycheck. They're not seeing how these slogans, these platform ideas translate into actual policies that are going to change their day-to-day lives. And people told us that when we did voter outreach in North Philadelphia. They said, what are they going to do? Nothing has changed in this neighborhood since I've been here. I don't see what the Democrats, for example, are doing. There's an awareness that Democrats control a lot of the seats in Philadelphia and even in parts of the state in Harrisburg. And they just weren't seeing it. And so people need to see that there has been progress, that there has been change made as a result of people being in power. I think a lot of these incumbents take their position for granted, and they're not showing the work that they've done in the last 4 years. And so people, they feel disenfranchised. They feel that there's an apathy, and they don't want to go out to vote. People need to stop talking in generalities and get into specifics and present very real policy proposals that they think are achievable. Like, for example, on the issue of gun violence, people that we talked to were very frustrated. They said, what are they doing to stop the violence here, to stop the shootings? And as you know, every week in Philadelphia, there's more and more shootings and murders and assaults. And so they're not seeing how some of these politicians like John Fetterman or even Josh Shapiro are going to be able to stop the violence in places like North Philadelphia. They're not seeing how they're going to stop the opioid crisis and the heroin from getting into places like Kensington. They're not able to see how they can stop the inflation and the amount of money it costs now to put food on the table, or to stop the rising cost of rents due to gentrification. And so when you're not speaking to quote unquote working class issues, people aren't going to come out and vote for you. And I think we also need to be real that these mediocre white Democratic candidates, they're not relatable to people of color. They're not talking about Black issues. They're not talking about mass incarceration or policing or racism and discrimination. John Fetterman barely touched on those issues. They're not talking about Latinx issues, not really have viable solutions for the immigration crisis and for Puerto Rico's colonial status. So if you want people to vote for you, speak to their issues, learn the language that they speak in, invest resources, spend time in their neighborhoods, and see about the issues that affect them on a day-to-day basis. And then maybe you'll see a higher voter turnout. You also have to support accessibility and civic education if you want people to know how to vote.
And Vanessa makes an extremely good point. One thing that kind of drove me crazy throughout this campaign was you're going to come to a place like Philadelphia. First of all, you're only going to come in the last 2 or 3 weeks of the campaign, and you're going to put all your visits together on that. Before that, you're only walking around with certain elected officials that are friends of yours that are taking you to friendly areas where you're not necessarily seeing the pain that's going on in these areas. Then when you do talk to these people, when you do talk to us, basically I'm sitting there and I'm like, am I talking to you or am I watching your commercial? And after a while, I got to a point where I'm like, I'm a reporter and I'm covering this, but I'm cutting you off because I've already heard this. And the thing is, we needed some depth. But because of how the primary went, because of the money that was put into ads, because of all of that stuff that was actually an insulator in a lot of ways, a lot of questions didn't get asked. And now we have someone who is going to be representing us in the United States Senate that we don't know what they're actually going to do for us because we never got to have that policy discussion. And because we didn't get to have that policy discussion, again, Philly already had a senator that basically paid no attention to the city's needs. And Pat Toomey was proud of that in some weird ways, never having any town halls, never having any discussions of that kind. So we've already had a senator that has basically told us to kick rocks. It's going to be interesting to see if the people who single-handedly got John Fetterman elected to the Senate demand that he not do the same.
And to your point, Denise, it felt like Philadelphia was almost an afterthought for our statewide candidates, which is strange considering it's the largest county and city in the Commonwealth. And if it didn't come out the way it did, we might be having a very different discussion right now. So Denise, let's start with Pennsylvania in general.
Mm-hmm.
What is the number one takeaway or the number one surprise from yesterday for you?
Well, probably the biggest surprise for me is the fact that the Pennsylvania House of Representatives looks like it's going to switch from Republican to Democratic control. It's looking, if the numbers work out the way that they are presently, it's looking like Joanna McClinton is going to become the new Speaker of the House, the new Majority Leader in the House. And what made that unusual and surprising to me is that the conventional wisdom when it comes to midterms is that whoever the party in power is in the White House, they usually get like their butt kicked in the midterms. They usually lose seats in the federal House and Senate. They lose seats in the local houses and Senate. Everybody just about gets, their butt kicked. And that's not what happened here. In fact, Democrats across the country, they're saying now that Joe Biden might have a historic midterm in terms of how much he didn't lose and how much he actually gained in some cases, depending on how the numbers shake out federally. The Democrats may retain the federal House and Senate, in addition to picking up the Pennsylvania House. So that was probably the biggest surprise to me, the fact that it wasn't 2010, 2009, 2010, the sequel.
Vincent, let me come to you. Denise just talked about the Democrats possibly retaking the state house, that House of Representatives. What was the biggest surprise or takeaway from yesterday for you?
Okay.
It looks like we don't have Vincent. So Vanessa, let me come to you with that same question. Biggest takeaway or surprise from yesterday?
I mean, I'm not really surprised, but I'm really disappointed that so many people in Pennsylvania voted for Doug Mastriano, even though Josh Shapiro voted by a wide margin or won by a wide margin. In looking at other gubernatorial races across the country, where Democrats they lost big in the South, right? Seats like Texas and Florida, Arkansas, Alabama, all those states went for Republican governors by really wide margins. And a lot of times the Democratic candidates only got, 35, 37% of the vote. And that just didn't happen to Doug Mastriano in this case. And in my opinion, he's an extremist, right? He admittedly participated on January 6th activities, made very extreme statements calling for the arrest of women who have abortions and many other, what I would call fascist ideology. And it seems as though Republicans still stayed with their party and voted for him, even though he was really a terrible candidate, even by Republican standards. Interesting enough, you can make the same argument about somebody totally unqualified like Dr. Oz and people like Herschel Walker. Like, these people have never held any type of public office before. They're completely unqualified to be U.S. senators. A lot of their ideas were really wacky and very racist and discriminatory, especially from Dr. Oz. And yet we saw that a lot of people still voted for them. And so that's really disappointing. I as a woman, I feel really troubled that so many people are still promoting candidates that are against a woman's right to choose and against our access to reproductive health. And so for me, it really shows that there's still a lot of work to do, right? There's a lot of organizing that needs to be done in order to stop these candidates, because they certainly won't be the last ones to pop up in these elections promoting these points of views, and they're still wildly popular. And so that shows us that, this fight is not over, and that if we want better candidates, we have to organize better to shut these folks down and to make sure that they don't get the votes to even win primaries to be at this point. So very disappointed to see people vote for them, but glad that they did not win.
Lance, what stood out to you from yesterday?
What stood out was how well fear worked as a way of getting votes. The Republicans ran a campaign: be afraid of the Democrats, be afraid of crime, be afraid of immigration, be afraid of this, be afraid of transgendered people. And the Democrats, instead of responding and saying, here's what we're going to do, used fear in the opposite direction. They said, be afraid of what the Republicans are going to do. And it's hard for any candidate not to use fear as a tactic if fear works so well. Most of us who ended up voting didn't know what the candidates stood for in their platforms. We knew what we were afraid of. And it didn't really matter whether we were voting for Republicans or we were voting for Democrats. We were still voting out of fear. The number one issue, I believe, was how bad the other person was. And to the extent that we want to build a future for ourselves, a future where we can have some communal agreement, the understanding that we all want a better life for our children, that we all want good schools, that we all want safe neighborhoods, that we all want employment that pays a living wage. If all we do is run against the other person without preparing some vision, without preparing some aspirations, without coming forward with here is what we can aspire to and here's what we can do, it's going to be very hard for us to go forward and not continue to fall back on fear as a tactic.
Let me re-welcome Vincent Thompson of Thompson Mediaman Communications. Vincent, there we go.
There you go. I think third time is a charm. I think I was
There
able
we
to fix
go.
my text problems. How are you?
Good. So, Vincent, let me ask you. Big day yesterday. What's a key takeaway or surprise from yesterday in Pennsylvania that stood out to you?
Well, I think if you look at the map, the key surprise to me was two things. One, Featherman won, and Shapiro won. It's not like we didn't expect that they would win, but I still think if you look at the map, most of the state was Republican. So the areas that are still solidly Republican, solidly red, went Republican. Now, a Josh Shapiro or a Featherman may have gotten 10% or 15%, but there's still a massive divide in this state where the center part and the western part are still heavily Republican leaning. And if you look at the map, the big centers, the population centers are what won it for Featherman and won it for Shapiro. You know, Philadelphia, the suburbs, Allentown, Harrisburg, Pittsburgh, those kind of things. So that's, you know, I'd like to call that the Ed Rendell won, how he won for governor strategy, where he didn't win the whole state, but he won the most populous counties and thus became the governor. And then the second thing, and I know that you've mentioned this, is that Democrats have done so well in the state house that we may have the Democrats taking over the state house for the first time in decades, and that could lead to Joanna McClinton becoming the Speaker of the House, and she would be the first female Speaker of the House and only the second African American to be the Speaker of the House. The first one was the late K. Leroy Irvis. So those are the two things that came out of this election to me.
And Vincent, you and I had spoken earlier today about the number of African American congresspeople from Pennsylvania. We were talking about Summer Lee in the western part of the state, how she won her election and is Congresswoman-elect. How important is that? And can you break down just a little bit of the history quickly about who these people were and what they did?
Right. So, I mean, I think having representation matters, right? In the state of 12 million people, having diversity in all levels of government, whether it's your local city councils, your school board, mayors, governors, that's important. To have Summer Lee becomes not only the first African-American female congressperson from the state of Pennsylvania, she will also be the first African-American congressperson in the western part. So all the black congresspeople we have been men, and all of them have been out of Philadelphia. So Summer Lee makes history by being the first African-American woman and also being the first African-American congressperson outside of Philadelphia. The other ones are, the other former congressmen have been Robert N.C. Nick Sr., now I'm putting on my hat, Bill Gray, Shaka Fatah, Lou Blackwell, and the current Congressman Dwight Evans.
That's right. So,
can I chime in real quick? Because let's not forget Austin Davis, our first ever Black lieutenant governor in Pennsylvania, which is also a really big deal.
And it's an even bigger deal than people think, because let's face it, with the exception of the current Auditor General who ran as a Republican, it is rare for a person of color to get elected statewide in Pennsylvania. I mean, it's like, putting a camel through the eye of a needle is easier. It almost never happens. And I'll really be impressed if a woman of color actually finds herself in a statewide row office.
So if you're a Pennsylvania Democrat, you feel like you had a good night yesterday. You defied all expectations for a midterm election when the president's also a Democrat, winning the governorship, United States Senate seat, doing well in congressional races, and more than likely at this point taking back the state house. Ordinarily on this program, we don't talk necessarily a lot of national politics. We keep it more local, but I do want to just pull out a little bit more. Pennsylvania was a great victory for the Democrats, but it's not necessarily the same throughout the rest of the country. There were some hits and misses for Democrats, but not exactly the red wave that we had been hearing about, which I don't think any of us really thought was going to happen. I didn't see in 1994 when Bill Clinton lost 63 House seats. I didn't see that happening. Why didn't that happen?
Well, it kind of helps that Donald Trump and company, because let's face it, he is still the de facto head of the Republican Party. If you put totally insane people on the ballot, most of us are not going to vote for them. I mean, Vanessa was correct when she was talking about Texas and Florida and the Senate race in Georgia. That is still the example of the single most cruel act I've ever seen anyone do in politics, by putting an obviously addled person on a ticket and say, hey, vote for this person, despite the fact that you're not sure he even knows where he is right now. And, I think that the reason why you didn't get the red wave is because they kept putting the Doug Mastrianos and Herschel Walkers and Greg Abbotts of the world on the ticket. And while they may have performed better in places where gerrymandering is also an issue, most people were like, I'm not going to send somebody that I know is incompetent or isn't quite well in the head, or who basically is going to Congress or the State House with the sole and intent purpose of taking my rights away. And I'm not going to send them to a place where they have the power to do it. Also, you had a lot of states where abortion was literally on the ballot. Like, for example, Kentucky, where my family was from. They sent Rand Paul back to Congress, and that's what Kentucky tends to do. But it also passed an amendment. It also struck down an amendment that would have codified an abortion ban in Kentucky. So you had places where abortion was literally on the ballot, and in all of those places, a woman's right to choose, or just about all those places, a woman's right to choose won out. So that also kind of kept, the Republicans from going nuts.
Just to pick up on what Denise was saying, and I think it's important. One of the things I've learned in my years of doing this is that you never know what an election is going to be, right? An election's a snowflake. Every snowflake is different. Every election is different. But I do think even when you take a national issue, or you take a national race and national media is looking at it from a big kind of 10,000 foot perspective, people still look at local issues, right? They look at the man or woman and say, is this person okay? Should I vote for him? If they feel that that person is nuttier than a fruitcake, most Americans don't vote for that person, right? We may hiccup and vote for a crazy person every once in a while, but once we see the damage that they've done, we don't vote for them again, a la Donald Trump, right? So we see it, right? And I think that plays a role as well. And people always look at their personal issues in elections. And I think that kind of sorts itself out after a while. This American democracy is frustrating and makes you pull your hair out, and you wonder sometimes why people do what they do. But in the end, generally, it shakes out. Now, the thing that concerns me the most is, are we seeing the end of the Donald Trump hold of the party, where just years ago, if Donald Trump had have endorsed the ham sandwich would have won a race? Or are people saying, wait a minute, I don't want Donald Trump to be in control of the party? I personally think it's just a hiccup, right? I still think all roads on the Republican Party lead to Donald Trump, or through Donald Trump. And if he runs for president again, I hate to say it, I could see him being the front runner once again for the Republican nomination, because Trumpism is so ingrained in the party that I don't think it's going to change for years and years to come. But I do think that generally voters get it right, whether it's local races, national races, they generally get it right from their local perspective.
I think there's some other things to learn from this election. One is how bad the pollsters were.
Oh,
this is not the first year that the pollsters have been significantly wrong. And I'm hoping that those people in the media who report on the polls as if the polls are meaningful will stop doing that. The second thing is we have an experience in Maine with a Trump-like governor, LePage, who was defeated, moved to Florida, and then moved back to Maine to run again. And the voters in Maine who had seen LePage for 4 years be just mean-spirited, nasty, ballistic, bellicose, he has been voted out of office, and they have retained a woman governor who is stable. And I think we're going to get some of the answers that Vincent's been asking in the Alaska Senate race. So there is one of Trump's number one enemies. The current senator from Alaska is engaged in an election, which is an unusual election in that the winner has to get more than 50%, and they keep dropping off the lowest vote getter. So we're going to see if the senator who is opposed to Trump, who has voted to impeach Trump, is going to get reelected from Alaska, which is not a liberal state by any stretch of the imagination, but they did vote for a Democratic congressperson. Alaska only has one congressperson. She's a native person. And two, it does appear now from the polls that the current senator who voted to impeach Trump is going to be reelected. So I think that is an indication that the population, not everyone, maybe not even most people in the Republican Party, but most voters are people who have seen these type of tactics, been tired of them, and really want to have people who govern who are going to be able to accommodate people who don't agree with them. And finally, I know we make a lot of the election in Florida and say how well DeSantis did. I think what goes underreported there is how low the voter turnout was.
right.
And that's because DeSantis, in part, made it very difficult for people to vote. And we should keep that in mind, that if you put your thumb on the scale, you're going to more than likely win. And nobody should be surprised. If you can cheat, you increase your chances of winning. And rather than talk about DeSantis as being this great example of a great strategist or a great candidate, we ought to talk about him being a phenomenal cheat, someone who hurt democracy, who brought down the turnout. So there's 12 percentage points less people voting than voted 4 years ago for governor. And that's why he won by 10 points, not because he was a better candidate, not because the Latino community came out for him, but because he kept people away from voting.
And I think if you look at Stacey Abrams, that's what got Brian Kemp the first time, right? He was the Secretary of State in the first race. So like Lance says, if you put your hand on the scale, you can turn an election. That's why it's important to make sure that people don't do that. That's why this show is fantastic. And I always tell people, politics impacts you every day. It isn't something that you can just say, well, I'll get to it, or well, I'll wait 6 months, or well, I'm not worried about it all. It impacts you every day. So everybody that you elect, everybody who's running should have your attention and time, because in some way, shape, or form, that person is going to impact you if they're in elected government. I say it all the time. You're not in the world. You're not a human being until you get a birth certificate, right? And that's a government agency. And you haven't died until somebody gives you a death certificate. And that's an agency. And everything in between impacts people. And I'm frustrated sometimes because I don't think people see enough of that, right? They don't understand what this means to them. And Vanessa says it all the time. Voter education isn't just a couple of weeks before the election. Voter education needs to be a daily process, knocking on doors, empowering people every day. And that's something that, needs to happen more, whether it's parties like the like an independent party or whether it's an elected official, we got to educate people about the importance of coming out because it's critical.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it has to happen now, right? If we're
Right.
concerned about 2024 presidential elections, like the clock is already ticking, right? We need to start those voter education, civic information campaigns right away. And the reality is that people under 40, people from the ages of 18 to 40, by and large, do not vote. And yet they're some of the people most impacted by these policies. Again, when I polled my students in my college course, who's registered to vote, most of them were not and had never voted. And so I encouraged them, to get registered for extra credit. Only a few of them did. I think part of the problem is we don't have a lot of candidates that inspire. And I'm sorry, but I don't like John Fetterman. I thought he was very rude every time that I've met him in person. He's like kind of weird looking. He's unfriendly. He's awkward. He's always wearing that stupid sweatshirt. It just doesn't inspire, even Josh Shapiro, he's like your moderate, run-of-the-mill Democrat. There's nothing exciting about him. I don't see Latina women like me reflected in these candidates. We have our one AOC out there, but that's about it. We don't see a lot of other Black women, Asian women running. Just, in general, there's not enough women running for office across the board all over the country. It's very difficult to win if you're a woman. And there's not a lot of younger people, right? A lot of the people that are running incumbents for a very long time. So, we can educate people. We could teach them, how to vote, why it's important to vote. We can change the messaging. But ultimately, if people don't see themselves reflected or represented in their government, they're not going to feel that their interests are represented. And I think that's a big part of the problem, as we have a large growing demographic of Latinos in the United States. We're not represented in Congress. We're not represented in the courts. And so, if you want more people to vote, we need more people to run. And it needs to be easier for people to run. We need campaign finance reform. Look how much money was spent in Pennsylvania on this senatorial race. Record-breaking numbers, hundreds of millions of dollars poured in from super PACs and dark money in order to fuel all those ads. And thankfully, we don't have to watch those ads anymore. But the average person who has really good ideas, who has been committed to public service, maybe has done a lot in their community, it's very difficult for people like them to be competitive in these races. And let's be honest, in places like Philadelphia, even if you want to run as a Democrat, you have to get past the Democratic Party machine. The same is true in South Jersey, right? Like we have Democratic Party bosses acting as the gatekeepers and not allowing people to compete. I mean, a lot of times when we've seen activist candidates run, they've been sued and defeated in the courts by Democrats themselves. Their opponents really haven't been Republicans or libertarians. And so, we have to allow more people to run. I think this two-party system is really antiquated and maybe not robust enough to represent all the different interests that people have. And that's why they feel disillusioned and they don't feel like their vote counts. And as Lance was alluding to, when we see voter disenfranchisement, when we see people cheating or making it really, really difficult for people of color to vote, when we see so much targeted disinformation on social media platforms going unregulated, targeted towards communities of color, that all makes an impact too. People are experiencing all different types of environmental factors, what makes it harder for them to come out and vote. And, to answer your question that you asked just a little bit ago, in terms of, why the red wave didn't happen, because Black voters saved the day once again. The majority of Black voters vote Democrat, overwhelmingly so, all across the nation. And again, we have to thank Black voters for coming out one more time to make sure the fascists don't take control. And then we also have to reckon with the fact that most white people voted Republican, and not all Republican candidates are bad, but a lot of them are racist. A lot of them are misogynistic, homophobic. A lot of them have fascist, authoritarian tendencies. And there didn't seem to be a big reckoning in that way. They're still voting for those types of candidates. So we have to reckon with this fact about how divided our country is right now and how reliant the Democratic Party is on Black voters and other voters of color to come out and save the day and make sure their candidates win.
Well, to kind of piggyback on what you said, Vanessa, it's hard for women in particular to get money to run. I'm interested in seeing how the mayoral campaigns in 2023 shake out, because a lot of women are running, and traditionally it is hard for women to raise money. People are still in a lot of ways looking politically toward the 50s, where women didn't run for office. They basically stayed home and made dinners and had teas to raise money for their husbands as they ran for office. And it'll be interesting to see what, if anything, turns out differently. And, let's just, put the elephant in the room out there, in terms of why it feels like Black women, and if you go on Twitter for 5 minutes, you will realize that Black women are kind of getting tired of this in particular, and Black people in general have to come in and save the day. It's because proximity to whiteness is a hell of a drug. And for a lot of people, after you've mainlined it your entire life, and I'm directing this specifically at the 73% of white women who still went in the booth and voted for Greg Abbott, despite the fact that he basically let a bunch of school kids get killed at Uvalde, and even including the city of Uvalde itself, that overwhelmingly voted for him. That proximity is a hell of a drug. And until we can start to wean people off of that, we're still going to continue to see stuff that does not necessarily benefit everybody, and in fact is bad for everybody. Because a lot of the question that we find ourselves asking is, this is against your own interest. Why do you keep voting for this person? And it goes back to that proximity. And if you have been programmed to believe your entire life that proximity to whiteness is the goal, and it's going to reflect in your electoral choices. And unfortunately, that is still what we're dealing with. And until we're not dealing with that, you're going to have places like the American South, which is predominantly Black, where you have people that aren't necessarily allowed to represent themselves for reasons ranging from some of the weirdest gerrymandering you will ever see to straight up intimidation.
So we spoke a little bit about what happened nationally. What does yesterday's election mean for Philadelphia?
I think it's just a snapshot in time. Mayoral elections are like the things I always say, how we have to get people ginned up to run and ginned up to get an interest. You had that this year with the Senate and the governor's race. But next year, mayor elections, city council elections are sexy elections, right? They're probably the ones where the turnout is the highest locally out of all the elections, because there's going to be a lot of interest, a lot of money spent on commercials. And I think, what you see this year might not be the same that you see for mayor's races and city council races, because a lot of those are going to be local issues. Who's the best candidate as far as the future of the city? And when you're looking at council, is this district council person been good for me? Do I think that district council person is a bum and should be thrown out? At large races, I always say, are like mini mayor's races. They just don't raise as much money. And those races are who you can get, the connections with and where you can get your little pockets of votes in. So the issues next year are going to be completely different than this one. I think next year is going to be a referendum basically on Jim Kenney. Like, did you like Jim Kenney? Do you think his policies are good? Who do you want to see replace Jim Kenney, right? What do you want them to bring to the table? And I kind of call this the kind of remember when John Street couldn't run for re-election anymore and everybody ran against John Street? This is going to be the same thing with everybody runs against Jim Kenney.
I do think that the election is going to be more money for the city of Philadelphia, and this is where it gets difficult. With all the criticism, and I agree with most of it, with all the criticism, the difference between Mastriano and Shapiro in terms of funding the city and funding programs is very real. The difference between having a Democratic state house and a Republican-controlled state house is very real in terms of money. So I think the city of Philadelphia financially is going to be better off with Shapiro in office with a Democratic state house. I think one of the difficulties is going to be for the schools. Governor-elect Shapiro hasn't really said whether he's going to continue to support the Republican attempt to dismantle the public school system. And I think that's really at risk. And I think some of the Democrats in the Philadelphia delegation are big supporters of dismantling the public school system. And we'll have to see how that plays out. But in terms of infrastructure, in terms of job programs, in terms of support for community college, Philadelphia will be better off under this new government than we were under the old government. If the Democrats keep control of the Senate, the same thing would be true. I'm just going to remind our viewers that the state of Pennsylvania got all the stimulus money from the federal government and put most of it in the bank. We're not spending it. And having a Democratic-controlled state house and a Democratic governor should release some of that money and should be able to be used to invest in our neighborhoods that desperately need help.
Yeah, I'll also say, as a woman, I feel satisfied that women's right to choose has been protected in the state of Pennsylvania. There's been several attempts, as you know, from the current Republican legislature to limit our rights to abortions and reproductive health that were luckily vetoed by our current Governor Wolf. And, one of the things that both Fetterman and Shapiro have guaranteed is that they ran on that platform, that they promised to protect abortion rights in Pennsylvania. So at least for 4 more years, we can hopefully see either, maintaining our current rights or extended rights, maybe even codifying it into the Constitution if we have a Democratic-controlled legislature. But we'll see. I feel like they're going to continue to chip away at those rights. I'm definitely looking to see, what will happen at the federal level. So far, Biden's attempts, to preserve women's reproductive rights in states where it's been banned hasn't really been effective. And so we're all waiting to see what the next step is and how these candidates will continue fighting for women. But I do think that at least for the short term, women can feel pretty safe in the state of Pennsylvania.
And I think, Larry, another thing that people should look out for is now that Josh Shapiro is going to be governor, he's going to have to give up his attorney general seat, right? And usually, if I'm correct, the governor appoints the interim attorney general. So you could have an interesting situation where either Josh Shapiro resigns a couple of days before he gets sworn in as governor, and then Tom Wolf could appoint the successor, or the attorney general could resign the day of his inauguration, get sworn in as governor, and be the person that appoints his successor. So I'm curious to see who his successor will be, because that successor, I think, would have like 2 years before they'd have to run for re-election. There's a whole host of people that are looking to run for attorney general. If I was the African American community, because we've been a loyal supporter of the Democrats, I would be pressing on the Democrats very, very hard that there should be a person of color who's the attorney general, black woman, black gentleman. So it's going to be interesting to see who's the next attorney general in the state of Pennsylvania, because they have to fight for issues like abortion rights and consumer services. So that's something I think people should look at come January of 2024.
Well, that would be an interesting appointment, because not only does it do so many things, not just symbolically, but also effectively, but it also gives that person a head start for re-election in a state that has not been kind to African-American candidates across in statewide elections.
Whoever gets that position becomes the front runner to keep the seat.
Certainly. Is there anything else that happened locally in Philadelphia? Now, we did have 4 city council elections, special elections, in the 7th district, 9th district, and 2 at large. We also had 2 ballot questions that both passed, creating the Department of Aviation and the CTE charter change, which I'm struggling to articulate.
We added points on the civil service exam.
Yes.
Yes. Is there anything from those, and we only have a couple minutes left actually, from those elections or those ballot questions that stands out to you?
I was surprised that the Working Families Party didn't run anyone. It seemed to me that this would have been an opportunity for them to run a candidate, and they chose not to. I don't really understand their strategy. I don't understand what they're thinking. But the only candidates that were on the ballot were the Democrats.
Well, there were Republican candidates. They just got beat.
There were libertarian candidates too for all of the special elections as well.
So the libertarians actually did field a decent slate of, well, when I say, I mean, they fielded candidates for office, including one who, I think it was Axios, did a little question and answer session with all the candidates, and they included the libertarians. And the last question was, give us a fun fact about yourself. And, one person said, I have a dog. Another person said, I like gardening. And one of the libertarian candidates said, I never once wore a mask during the pandemic. It's astounding to me. But when, the nomination process itself, and I think we've all maybe spoken about this together off the air, to me is a little troubling, may not be the right word, may go a little too far, but it's strange that there isn't a primary election. It's just the ward leaders choose the candidates. Does that, we only have a couple minutes left. Is that an issue for people, or is that okay?
I don't think it's an issue for people, but remember, that's something, and Lance can tell me if I'm wrong, that's something that's set in state law, right?
Yeah.
So if you want to change that policy, you got to go up to Harrisburg and get a bill that changes that policy. I don't see that policy changing, right? I'm just going to keep it 100. I don't see it changing.
And I think if we were to do an analysis of where the Democratic Party machine is strongest, we would see that was a very high voter turnout. So it cuts both ways. If you dismantle, like the 21st Ward, which is Roxborough, Mattiunk has a very strong ward leader. If you dismantle that, then you don't get the votes to elect Fetterman and Shapiro. And it's a conundrum. I'm not saying that I agree with it, but I am acknowledging that if you don't have the Northwest political machine for West Oak Lane, for the 50th Ward and the 10th Ward, and you don't have strong ward leaders, you can't get people registered to vote, and you can't get people out to the polls. The problem is for low-income wards, we don't have strong ward leaders, we don't have people doing the work, and we have people who are disenfranchised. So
I think there's one thing that we can agree on in politics tonight, that the Republicans and the Democrats will not change that law that ward leaders appoint the successor for races. Now, I think, Lance, what you're saying, I think people should look ahead to 2023. I do believe, and I'm just spitballing here, I do believe that we could see an election that when November of 2023 ends, we could still have, for at-large, the 5 Democrats, and I could see us having no Republican at-large members. So it'd be like the Working Families Party or some other independent party. I could see that happening because of the way things are going.
Thank you all. We're going to have to end it right there. Thank you all for being with us. We'll be back next week on Hall Monitor.